Hey everyone, we're going to get started momentarily. Thank you so much for starting your day with us.
And there's plenty of room up front. If don't be shy to come up. I think we'll have more of a conversation given the hour and the size of the room and the number of people in the room. It'd be great to have people up here.
Okay, good morning, St. Louis. Good morning to our virtual audience. We're so glad to be with you and ending what's been, hopefully for all of us, a really powerful, inspiring 3 days together, discussing the future of our movements and the future of this work. Today at Lawyering for Liberation, we're pleased to offer you a panel that we've entitled Responding to White Supremacist Violence, which we are proposing to both reflect, react, and center the ways that Black and Brown activists have been and can respond to the wave of white supremacist violence that seems quite purposeful in its attempt to terrorize us, to make us feel unsafe in our neighborhoods, in our supermarkets, including in places like my hometown of Buffalo, New York, while at the same time centering an analysis of the state and the ways that law and legal responses oftentimes can perpetuate state violence, including when we're working in the name of combating terrorism. So our goal today is to both give voice and despair to the Black communities and movements who are confronting mass murder, the mass murder of Black people, again, in places like Buffalo, Charleston, everywhere, where it's both has metaphorical aspects of disinvestment, segregation, racialized terror from the police, but also increasingly from people who are empowered to pick up AK-47s and directly target us. We're going to contextualize this moment, particularly since there have been increased calls for new frameworks and logics of laws to counter terrorism as a response, by also really examining the history of counterterrorism tools in past moments of crisis and their impact on Black, Muslim, and other targeted communities. We're going to explore legislative responses and what impact our movements could have in shaping legislation. And we're going to explore and really confront the tensions between meeting the fear and the anxiety that communities are feeling at the hands of these white perpetrators of violence, while also really trying to explore abolitionist values and kind of explore and really sit with the contradiction and the tensions. And as we have this discussion, we're going to invite you all to both remember and reflect with us on the costs of resisting counterterrorism as a narrative to white supremacist violence, when we are also in an environment where Black identity is always maximally punished, whether violent or not. And as we grapple with these meaty issues, I am so pleased to be joined by this incredible panel of folks that I'm pleased to call colleagues, current and former. I myself, I'm Chinyere Ezie, pronouns are she, her. I'm with the Center for Constitutional Rights, where I work as a senior staff attorney at the intersection of racial justice, gender justice, and LGBTQ+ rights. I'm a proud, albeit grieving native of Buffalo, New York, where so very recently we saw a massacre that was made possible by the undeniable ways that Buffalo, New York has been shaped by racial segregation, such that there is one Black grocery store. You can figure it out by Googling zip codes and understanding, again, how much disinvestment there has been in the city of Buffalo. I wrote a recent op-ed about it. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, where I tweet and scream into space as Lawyer Girl, GRRL. But let me get to the important work of introducing my colleagues who are here today. Starting immediately to my left, I'm joined by Aya Saeed, who is counsel and policy advisor for Congressman Cori Bush, where she leads the Congresswoman's foreign policy, immigration, and criminal justice portfolio. Aya has led opposition to Title 42 by organizing over 100 sitting members of the House and Senate to oppose the Biden administration's use of Title 42, which is an immigration statute for those who are still learning, to expel and deport migrants and asylum seekers, which actually led, because Aya is a badass, to the administration's decision to rescind the policy. Aya has also worked closely with a large coalition of over 100 organizations to secure over 70, there's a zero after that, $1 million to fund non-carceral public safety programs. Previously, Aya was a Bertha Justice Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where I had the privilege of working with her and getting to know how brilliant and committed an advocate she is. And Aya is also a graduate of Harvard Law School and Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. Because we all gotta have hobbies, y'all, and love on ourselves outside of the law. Aya is also currently finishing her first novel, Daughters of the Nile, represented by Janklo and Nesbitt. So get into it, and please join me in welcoming Aya. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Diala Shamas, who is a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she works on so many important issues, including Palestine liberation and solidarity work, where she challenges government and law enforcement abuses of power, and really is a leading voice in the national security space. Prior to joining the Center for Constitutional Rights, Diala was a clinical supervising attorney and lecturer in law at Stanford Law School, and a senior staff attorney supervising CLEAR, which is the Creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility Project at CUNY Law School in New York. Diala has represented individuals who were approached for questioning by local and federal law enforcement, targeted for surveillance, placed on federal watch lists, and have had immigration benefits withheld on national security grounds, which is a way of saying that Diala knows in and out the way that counterterrorism laws are enforced in and on our communities. And we are so very grateful to have her expertise here today. Diala is a graduate of both Yale University and Yale Law School, where she was editor of the Yale Human Rights and Development Law Journal. She's a big deal, y'all. Please join me in welcoming Diala. And just so you know, I'm really embarrassing my colleagues and I'm enjoying it so very much. Last but not least is Omar Farah, who is a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where he's lead lawyer of Color of Change versus Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which seeks records that reveal the government's expansive surveillance of the movement for Black lives. Omar also focuses on an array of CCR litigation and advocacy that responds to abusive policing and counter-terrorism practices, including the unlawful surveillance of Muslim American communities, criminalization of dissent, and systemic unlawful policing practices. For more than a decade, Omar also litigated habeas corpus challenges on behalf of current and former Guantanamo Bay prisoners, including Tariq Ba-Oda, who spent nearly 9 years on hunger strike before being released to Saudi Arabia in 2016. Omar is a graduate of Columbia University and Georgetown University Law School, and a real issue expert who we're grateful to have today. Please join me in welcoming Omar. Okay, so I I think already framed up this discussion a little bit. You know, we are in communities that are really being wrecked with violence right now from outside, not from, you know, simply within. And oftentimes, certainly in the case of Buffalo, New York, it's from people who have an express and an unmitigated desire to cause harm and to inflict terror on Black people and to make our communities feel even further under threat. You know, I will be the first to acknowledge that having, I don't know, a ban on assault rifles would probably help a lot, but that doesn't seem like it's going anywhere since guns have more rights than people with birthing potential in this country right now. But you know, given the fear, given the direct targeting of our communities, I'm hoping, Diala, you could speak in the first instance to the work that you've been doing, where, you know, you have been really tackling questions about how to respond to sort of the counter-terrorism framework and the questions of surveillance and policing that it enables. I mentioned the counterterrorism framework because, you know, some of the work that's happening narratively in response to crises and mass murders like Buffalo is to just talk about, and I would say justifiably, the ways that these are forms of terrorism and the ways that, you know, white men in particular inflict terror on us, you know, at times without having the benefit of the label applied in the same ways that it's applied to us and our bodies readily. Including when we apparently just turn up for Black lives here. So Diala, as someone who has been actively working on questions of policing, surveillance, and counterterrorism for many years, what has that work revealed to you about how state power responds to crises? Crises, you know, where we are sort of demanding more safety, you know, at the community level. And what lessons, if any, are there to draw from that experience in developing responses to white supremacist violence?
Thanks, Chinyere. And good morning, everyone. It's really great to be on a panel with Omar and Aya and Chinyere. So I might start by just framing a little bit, more framing, adding to what you offered, Chinyere, and also maybe just reminding myself of many of the points raised over the course of the panels in the past few days as how we need to be thinking about these really difficult questions and the sort of opportunity and space that thinking about difficult questions can open up to be more creative and to push us to do better. So that's really my the just first reminder is that these are really difficult questions and that actually we don't have the answer, and that's okay. I can offer and share what I know based on my experiences. My experiences as a Palestinian, deeply familiar with how the label of terrorism can be used to really bring the full power of the military and the state and the global system to suppress your dreams, to put it succinctly. And also as an attorney who's worked with communities who've been designated as terrorists, who've been targeted as terrorists, and who've been surveilled, suppressed, silenced, infiltrated, and whose work has been disrupted under the guise of combating terrorism, particularly Muslim communities, those proximate to Muslim communities, as well as activists and advocates. And a lot of my work has been also around Palestinian rights advocates who are even in the US and not just in Palestine, labeled as terrorists or supporting terrorism. So I think in sharing those observations from those contexts, we can at least begin to explore some answers. The other reminder from an earlier panel, I think it was Tenji, where he said we need to lean into some of the contradictions, and here are the contradictions, to sharpen our analysis. And here is, I think, as you laid it out, like, yes, we do need a stronger response to white violence. There needs to be something needs to be done. But also, yes, we want to shrink the power of the state for all the reasons that I think we've been, people in this room, I think, fully understand, and we can hash out more And so how do we do these two things simultaneously? And thirdly, I think just what I'm carrying with me from the conference is that even if we don't have the right answers, we are seeing some solutions that are being offered up that are not the right solutions. And it is important to sort of dissect them, analyze them, use our expertise as lawyers, as organizers, as people who can offer some insights into sort of dissecting those interventions for movement so that we can offer up some better ones. So with that, just I might offer a little bit of a what has been happening. And it's sort of always hard to figure out where to start, but I can start on January 6th, because that's really when I started paying closer attention to how this discussion has been unfolding. As you all probably recall, immediately after the day of January 6th, when a violent mob, stormed the Capitol, there were immediate calls to not just call them terrorists, but as you were talking, narrative matters, but also narrative lends itself to policy interventions. And so immediately there was a number of efforts to push for legislation and policy interventions that would create basically call these people domestic terrorists, and drawing on the lessons of our counterterrorism infrastructure. The thing about the US counterterrorism infrastructure, as everybody probably knows, is that it's been sort of like it's been pegged to foreign terrorism. So most of the laws of the agencies are like unleashed when there's a nexus to a foreign terrorist organization. And so I think some of the thinking behind those who are advocating for these positions is that, well, we've got this really great, powerful infrastructure to go after foreign terrorists. So let's just turn it towards the domestic terrorists. And that is a great solution. And so there are many problems with that approach. One is the foreign terrorists, the counterterrorism system has been deployed and given meaning in ways that have been deeply discriminatory and harmful. And even if you just look at the foreign terrorist organizations, which is how you kind of can open up all of these counterterrorism tools, law enforcement tools. If you look at those organizations, they're mostly Muslim, or they're mostly organizations that are not aligned with US people who are in opposition to US allies abroad, right? Palestinians and others. And the overwhelming response to those kinds of efforts have been targeting Muslims in the US for actually before 9/11, and really kind of went on significantly increased post 9/11. The problems with these are not only that they're ineffective, but they're also abusive and harmful, right? So we've seen the expansion of FBI authorities to surveil communities under a preventative model, and on this assumption that if we just monitored where potential terrorists, eat and pray and convene, then we may be able to identify, acts of terrorism before they occur. Increased prosecutorial capacity to the point where we have really loose standards for who the state can go after under something called material support to terrorism. So even if you offer broadly defined services to someone that the government argues is an agent of a foreign terrorist organization, you can really unleash the full powers of the FBI's investigative and criminal capacities. We have obviously, increased funding enormously under in the expansion of the sort of counterterrorism architecture to the FBI and other agencies, creating creating an agency that needs to continue giving itself reasons to exist, right? So we've seen prosecutions that have very little to do with anyone's safety, that raise serious questions of entrapment and informants. The active use, the very aggressive and active involvement of informants in these kinds of cases that really raise questions as to the sort of motive of really pursuing these, and obviously from like a resource perspective haven't really made much sense to anyone who's looked at them closely. But that's kind of what happens when you create and expand these agencies, who then have to kind of continue to give themselves reasons to exist, reasons to draw salaries, reasons to get more resources. And so that's just a really big picture of how broad and expansive the counterterrorism architecture in the US is. And I think the concern with this logic that if we just then take it, yes, we understand the critiques of it is discriminatory, it's been harmful. Why don't we just fix that by recalibrating or redirecting it to white violence? I think that's, I just see a lot of risks with that kind of assumption. Firstly, it's ahistoric, and I'll just end with an example to just land the point of why it's ahistoric. It's not how this has happened in the past, even though we've been here before. We've thought through this kind of logic before. So folks might remember Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing. White man, killed a lot of people. And on the 1-year anniversary of that, we passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, ostensibly to address and to commemorate that act of violence, and to address the problem of this kind of white violence. But if anybody here who's worked in criminal justice, who's worked on behalf of criminal defendants, who's worked on behalf of immigrants, and who's also worked with Muslim communities, knows EDPA to have done nothing about white supremacist violence, but actually everything to prevent their access to courts, to basically make people with minor offenses automatically removable. And also it's what created the material support to terrorism laws that are only used against foreign terrorist organizations and have been then deployed in all sorts of ways to go after primarily Muslim communities, Muslim charitable giving, and that sort of thing. So even EDPA in 1996, ostensibly intended to address white violence, pushed as a bold intervention in that space, is actually something that has only been turned around against communities of color. And so that's, I think the concern is probably that many of us share, is that that's exactly what we will be seeing if we continue on this track of just expanding the powers of the state in responses to these acts of white violence. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Diala. It's kind of, to put it simply, a reminder of be careful what you wish for, to some extent. So Omar, I'd like to turn to you because, like Diala, you have experience working against the counterterrorism paradigm, including as it relates to Black political dissent. Can you share what you perceive to be the risks of calling for expanded targeting of white supremacist violence as terrorism?
Thanks so much, Chinyere. And just quickly before I begin, thanks so much to the organizers who have created this space for us to have the kind of exchange that we're having, which is so desperately needed in our collective movement work. I think particularly as lawyers, we need the opportunity to step back from our work and be students again, and sort of learn from each other and from others who are at the tip of the spear of so many of the struggles that we are wrestling with. And just lastly, also, I want to thank our sign language interpreters who have been working furiously over the last 2 days to keep up with us. Hopefully we'll speak slowly and clearly. Yeah, I mean, I want to think about Chinere, where you began and try to summon as much compassion and sorrow and rage as I possibly can, and in solidarity with people in Buffalo and across the country who don't have the privilege of stepping back and trying to think through these issues because they're burying folks and trying to put their life back together. And so I hope we can just carry that in our minds and our hearts as we have this conversation, and not skip too quickly to the analysis. But having said that, I think the way that I try to wrestle with these challenges is to sort of really internalize the fact that both the kind of horror that we saw in Buffalo and so many other parts of the country, and the domestic terror, counterterrorism framework, and it's not a framework, it's a web of legal policy and culture, that nexus is itself a very explicit expression of white supremacist violence. And I think we kind of have to wrestle with the fact that we're sitting in between those two really, really uncomfortable and often threatening postures. And just to dive into that a little bit more, I mean, I think 20 years on from the September 11th attacks, and to Diala's point, that's not necessarily the place that you would begin, but maybe instructive for this conversation. We have, I think, just sort of categories of work that we can look at to draw lessons from and to sort of tease out the various expressions of state white supremacy that our communities have been wrestling with. My orientation to the work in the beginning has been through Guantanamo. It's a known story, but just to pick up some threads of jurisprudence that have come out of Guantanamo, which I think are sort of clearly things to grapple with when you're talking about white supremacy, is just the tag association model that's landed so many of folks that I've represented in Guantanamo there for now nearly 20 years in counting. I mean, it's the law now that your association with individuals you're having traveled to, been in spaces that the government determines are sites of terror or potential terror, is enough to make you worthy of detention, perhaps for your natural life. I think that logic depends on a notion of certain individuals' proclivity towards violence that is based on identity in a very explicitly white supremacist way. Diala and I and Aya in her own way have all wrestled with the question of surveillance. I think it will be time to talk about that a little bit more, but I do want to just sort of unearth the very recent history of post 9/11 surveillance, which was really organized around explicitly ancestries of interest. Like certain categories of individuals are presumptively deserving of heightened law enforcement scrutiny by virtue of their identity. We have thought about that for years now as a counterterrorism policing tactic. I don't think we necessarily should have thought about it that way or need to continue thinking about that. That feels to me like quite an explicitly a white supremacist policing frame. Certain categories of people by their identity are threatening and therefore need to be watched, as Diala was just setting out. We don't, there's a lot of really rich thinking and scholarship about the particular ways that torture was organized post 9/11. Those were particularly like thought out, planned, constructed torture regimes that were themselves organized around certain notions of the way Muslim, Black Africans, Black people experience their identity and their dignity, and the torture regimes were meant to attack specifically that. And I just want to, as a place to sort of draw out the connections again, some of the torture regime that that grew up in Guantanamo and I think became so notorious at Guantanamo really got its start from the Chicago Police Department. And I think I'd encourage you all to sort of check out the Guardian's reporting on this. It's old now, but it's useful history, I think, to recognize how these things are not as siloed, right? Like police officers sort of steeped in anti-Black policing and torture and violence in Chicago, like transported to sort of develop those torture programs within Guantanamo. So we're not fighting different things in that sense. And that's before we even talk really, I think, about the targeted killing regime, which has been so devastating to Black Africans in the Horn of Africa and so many others. So I just want to locate us in what feels to me like twin challenges with maybe different valence that we have to try to navigate. But I want to focus for just momentarily on the question of Black political dissent, and I think we'll talk more about the way that ends up playing out in the conversations that we're having. But following the killing of Mike Brown and Eric Garner, the uprisings that took place registered with domestic law enforcement in a way that I think very neatly tracked to a foreign counterterrorism paradigm that ended up producing a response that I think is really important for movement folks to grapple with, right? Because it's the lifeblood of a movement-based response to crisis for us to organize, to show up, to raise our voices, and to do so in a way that sort of decries the violence, and I think lays bare the really sort of horrible way that state violence both attacks us and then attacks the ways that we have to resist. And so some of the work that CCR did immediately following that, and CCR does a lot of transparency and FOIA related work, was to try to uncover, sort of what were the patterns in policing responses to protests around the country. And some of the things that we uncovered, I think, are useful to wrestle with a bit, including like within the Department of Homeland Security, fear, real and in some cases, I think, sort of obviously invented, but leveraged for real purpose, that ISIS and foreign terrorist organizations were actively recruiting, Black dissenters showing up in the streets in Ferguson and around the country, which, on its face is absurd and maybe laughable. But I think if you think about the hyper-militarized response you saw in the streets reacting to those protests, you see kind of how that logic perpetuates itself and builds responses that end up playing out for like our movement actors here trying to respond to the things that we see in Buffalo, and that I think sort of demand our political response. So I don't think there's a way to think narrowly about a domestic terrorism framework that can be leveraged for our movement purposes that doesn't rebound in really horrible ways for not just for our sort of political organizing, but for the way that we need to respond to the future crises, which are surely coming our way. And that's also, just to go back to that history, that's also where we kind of saw the emergence of the Black identity extremist framework, which as a paradigm, I think, is also particularly threatening, right? Because it produces a logic that, as Diallo was kind of setting out, justifies blanket surveillance and suspicion of Black political activity, and there's really no way to get out from under that, because it tracks so neatly to identity and to race, and in fact, part of what I find, sort of an under-recognized part of the BIE revelations is the way that already at that time, state policing power were thinking about ways to reframe BIE in a more race-neutral way, right? So some of the analysis coming out of DHS at the time was about, the increased race-based political violence, not Black identity extremism, but just race-based political violence, which I think, again, makes it harder for us to respond to things that we know are sort of overtly racist, but creates all the more sort of power for state to leverage that against us. So, to Chinyere, to your question, I think the first step for us is to step back and kind of recognize the landscape that we're operating in, and to be really, really careful about what seems like tactical opportunities when the strategy, I think, is sort of organized against us. And I'm really looking forward to Aya's comments, because I know Aya's been in the trenches thinking about how this plays out on the national level.
Thank you, Omar. I think that is a perfect segue to Aya. You have such a unique vantage point working in Congress on the ways that these discussions that, again, perhaps start as narrative, saying what happened in Buffalo is terrorism, end up shaping policy and end up shaping it in ways that perhaps spiral from the objective that as activists we might be targeting. So can you speak a little bit about federal legislation proposals to address, that purportedly are responses to the violence that our communities have been facing? The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act in particular. Could you kind of help us understand what this proposed legislation does, doesn't do, and sort of insights about the compromise and the pitfalls that you've observed along the way?
You hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Shaniri, for that question, and just really want to echo the sentiments of Omar and Diala, just expressing gratitude to all the organizers who really brought the space together. As a happily retired attorney, it is still a delight to really be in these kinds of spaces and to honestly share the stage with my forever colleagues from CTR. I really want to sit with this question of language that I think that's sort of surfacing over and over again in this discussion, which is, someone who was in Congress on the day of January 6th, I couldn't help but feel terrorized in that moment. And remember vividly, like that day, so many members of Congress, Muslim members of Congress like Congresswoman Bush, who herself was an activist, having that knee-jerk reaction to say this is an act of terror. It just felt natural to say that this is terrorism. In some ways, because it is terrorism. But what I think we're all sort of coming back to is this idea that if we talk about this issue rhetorically as terrorism, then counterterrorism is what we're going to end up getting. And the reality of the matter is that from a legislative perspective, there's really no way to legislate to sort of eradicate white supremacy. I mean, what law is going to get rid of white supremacy? It just does not exist, right? You can't litigate white supremacy. Like, these are things that you can't really get at the heart of with these very blunt instruments. And that's sort of what gets us to where we are today. So, in the aftermath of January 6th, we had several pieces of legislation that were proposed. And frankly, some of them were in existence and were in the pipeline well before January 6th. And it actually reminds me of the post 9/11 era when the Patriot Act was being debated. It's not as though the Patriot Act came into being after 9/11. Actually, these were wish lists for law enforcement agencies for a very long time. But it wasn't until 9/11 happened that it became the sort of perfect opportunity, given the political landscape and the hysteria, to finally sort of shove them into law. So in any case, there were several domestic terrorism proposals well before January 6th. In the aftermath of January 6th, they sort of came back up to surface. And despite the sort of call of action in that moment, several members, our office included, were very, very, very explicit that there was absolutely no way that the Congresswoman or many of her colleagues were going to support a Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. And at the time, there were, as I've said, several pieces of legislation. Some were just off the wall nutty. I mean, like creating really broad definitions of domestic terrorism, creating new criminal statutes. I mean, you could just imagine how crazy folks got. But we sort of, despite our resignation, despite making clear our issues with the legislation, committee, so the House Judiciary Committee and leadership kept working on this piece of legislation. So what is it? The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act essentially creates an Office of Domestic Terrorism within the Department of Homeland Security, within the Department of Justice, and within the FBI to sort of monitor, track, and prosecute acts of domestic terrorism within the United States. It also included provisions that mandated that these new offices would report to Congress every 6 months as to their findings of white supremacist violence. So tracking patterns and growth of white supremacist violence, reporting on it, and sending that report back to Congress such that, our legislators can respond to the growing threat of quote unquote domestic terrorism, but specifically white supremacist violence. And part of what ended up happening once this legislation was sort of put out into the ether and had become a serious conversation post January 6th is we also saw the rise of attacks against members of the AAPI community. And that led to a really, really big coalition of communities of color making this their number one ask of leadership. Members of the Sikh community had come and lobbied, my boss and so many others to support this legislation. Organizations like Muslim Advocates. I mean, there were so many organizations that actually felt compelled to say that as vulnerable communities that we needed some form of a legislative response. And that's really helpful. And we'll talk later about, coalition building and whether or not there are windows of opportunities. But I think I just wanted to name that there were really vulnerable communities that came out to say that this is, in fact, the legislative response that we needed. Once the Buffalo tragedy happened, the political landscape made it such that even those that knew the pitfalls of what it meant to codify domestic terrorism had frankly no political room whatsoever to actually reject it as the framework, again, because we just don't have language for alternative legislation, right? What do you say to communities in St. Louis? I mean, my boss was an alum of an HBCU that was targeted by white supremacists, right? So what do you say to communities who are feeling that kind of vulnerability? It really left, I think, so many members, so many movements unsure of how to respond to, on one side, the understanding and awareness of the pitfalls of this kind of legislation on one side, and just the real fear and vulnerabilities on the other. What we were able to do is make minor changes to the legislation by really organizing some of our other colleagues who felt just as passionately about the dangers of domestic terrorism as a framing, to include things in the legislation to ensure that protesters were not going to be targeted by these offices, to heighten civil rights and civil liberties requirements in these offices, to really streamline the definition of domestic terrorism. And these were all in some ways wins to try to reduce the harm of codifying this piece of legislation, but still fundamentally, could not outright solve the sort of contradictions that we're pointing to in this conversation. And actually, let me add one thing, if I may. We've talked about looking at history to know what is bound to happen, and we actually don't need to look that far. I recall when we were going through the legislation within committee, every single Republican member introduced an amendment to include within the definition of domestic terrorism, quote, Black Lives Matter activists. I mean, first of all, I don't even know what that means. Like, anyone who's gone to a Black Lives Matter protest is now, a category I don't even understand. But that's where they're heading. I mean, they've made it explicitly clear that in the case, when a Republican administration is in power, which is inevitable, that this is explicitly what they deem to be domestic terrorist, and how they're going to be targeting quote unquote Black Lives Matter activists in the future.
As always, you're so knowledgeable. That's also terrifying. And it's a reminder, right, of some of the ways that some of the misconceptions you have before you, study critical race theory, become a legal realist. You have this, you're invited to have this sense that laws are neutrally applied, right? And so I think it's making that mistake of thinking And, what better example than the Second Amendment, and, lifting up people like Philando Castile, who would probably, very much disagree that we all have a right to bear arms. I think if you're assuming that domestic terrorism, if we create this weapon, that it'll be wielded in one direction rather than pointed back in our faces, that's really kind of where you're making the first mistake. Can you update us on the status of the legislation? Hopefully it has not passed, or.
It did pass through the House, did not yet pass through the Senate. But I unfortunately think we're about one tragic incident away from it passing through the Senate and signed into law.
But once again, you can still own assault rifles as an 18-year-old. So moving on to Omar, I would love for you to discuss your observations about the interplay between a potential expansion of the Counter-Terrorism Framework, even ostensibly, to counter, white violence, and your work responding to discriminatory policing practices.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Chinera and Aya, for grounding us in what's happening on the Hill, which has such direct impact on our movement work and our litigation responses, and our sort of understanding of the problem. I keyed into some of what you shared about kind of organizing ways of identifying white supremacist violence and being able to track that and understand and then respond appropriately, which I think dovetails with part of what Diallo's presentation was about, of just trying to understand the predictive nature of counterterrorism policing. I mean, that's the really challenging part of, I think, forming movement responses to extreme acts of violence, right? In moments of crisis, the pattern, and we've all been wrestling with this in our work in different ways, is for law enforcement to do a familiar shift, which is to move from responding to criminality, investigating criminality after it's happened, to taking on this kind of like omnipotent version of itself that can understand and predict and arrive at a solution for violence before it happens. And I think at times our conversation has been, not just here, but in general, has been about, particularly kind of egregious and horrifying examples of state power, as we've been talking about in the post 9/11 human rights crisis, and then these sort of extreme acts of white supremacist violence that is the basis of our conversation. But directly to your point, Chinera, I do think that we experience, and our movements experience, versions of this in street level policing all the time. And I just think it's part of what our responsibility is to step back and try to really understand how that plays out in day-to-day policing at the street, or quote unquote the street level. So concretely, I mean, I think this has largely been what the challenge that our movements have been wrestling with stop and frisk nationwide, not just in New York, but nationwide, right? Like what makes that kind of policing possible is a particular view of high crime neighborhoods and certain behaviors that give law enforcement the perceived ability to understand where crime is going to happen and be there before it does to interrupt it. Following, I think the pushback around stop and frisk nationally, part of it's kind of like the trick we've seen is a turn away from, or sort of like a revival of the fear of guns, which I think is alive and well, and part of what the horror of the Buffalo attacks are, like a real sense that gun violence is an urgent crisis for law enforcement to respond to. And so rather than kind of explicit race-based way that played out in stop and frisk, to start thinking about narrow, seemingly more narrow categories like gangs, for example. But if you look at sort of the way that policing is organized, it also tracks very specific kind of identity markers that are mutually reinforcing and kind of inescapable, right? So it's like your social media, your preferences, your music tastes, which of course are really proxies for race identity, and make it really, really difficult for targeted communities, Muslim, Black communities, to figure out ways to get outside of the sort of laser-like focus of policing. And I think it's really our responsibility in movement spaces to think about predictive policing as race-based policing, and to be kind of like, be serious about insisting on the dismantling of that. I mean, I think there's some other sort of other examples of that. I mean, again, I think part of what, and this is a failure not just of movements. I think lawyers have not been helpful in this regard. Like, part of what the experience was following 9/11 and the broad-based surveillance was, I think, a way of leveraging, I'm talking about lawyers who are working on these things, leveraging the sense of extreme fear that was produced by the post 9/11 human rights crisis as a way of making more powerful claims in court. And I think that led us into a foreign terrorism framing that Diala has set out, rather than maybe centering the way that those policing practices were really part of the exact same law enforcement targeting of Black communities that predates 9/11 and really cuts back to the founding of this country. And I'm thinking there about, clients that I've represented who were, are Black folks from Newark, who were active as in the civil rights, moment in the 60s, came out of the Nation of Islam, lived under basically like a perpetual stop and frisk regime, and were surveilled in that way. And then following 9/11, were surveilled again, like in the lifespan of one community, again for a third time, but under a totally different guise now, in responding to like post 9/11 terrorism. So it really has nothing to do with, in some ways, the counterterrorism and foreign terrorism threat. It really has to do with us as Black people in this country and other targeted communities. And I think maybe there's some value in thinking about this problem from the day-to-day grind of race-based policing that so many of the folks here at this conference and around the country are organizing against, because it might give us some pathways to do more of the dismantling work that we're talking about. So.
Diala, you shared in your opening remarks that having a discussion about white supremacist violence and counterterrorism is, in essence, to sort of be speaking to life and living in a place of contradiction, and, on one hand, we know how much the internet is being used to kind of facilitate facilitate white violence and racist organizing, right? And people are radicalizing themselves, in chat rooms, in forums, et cetera. But at the same time, we've been talking about the inevitability of these, the weapon of the law being wielded back at us. And so I was wondering if you could share a bit about how you've seen in the past kind of the terrorism or counterterrorism framework used really to kind of police speech in ways that serve the effect of, again, not suppressing terrorism, quote unquote, but criminalizing dissent.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's like a large part of CCR's docket, actually. So I can, rattle off a few cases. I mean, even without the domestic terrorism law in its worst form, and I think Aya is like also underselling the really important work that's been done in doing damage control. And I just kind of want to flag that, like, there's these the original domestic terrorism legislation was far worse, right? All sorts of like expanded powers, new crimes, material support to terrorism for domestic terrorist organizations that they wanted to designate, which would mean that, like, if you would give money to a Black Lives Matter group, once Black Lives Matter would inevitably be designated, right? That would like subject you to criminal and civil liability, right? So there was all sorts of on the wish list of these right-wing groups, like all sorts of, much worse provisions. And it's really like thanks to the work of Aya, her boss, people like Aya and other offices that like did a lot of damage control. And that's part of the work. That's a big part of the, the unfortunate like posture that we have to be in like seeing those kinds of threats on the horizon. But we have also state terrorism laws that get pushed, and also the FBI, by the way, like already has, almost unfettered ability to do whatever they want to you with very minimal, reason of suspicion like that. Those were the big post 9/11 gains. And so just, some examples that come to mind. I know our colleague Pam Spees represented activists in Louisiana who was part of a really smart kind of political, activist stunt, sort of mailed plastic pellets that this company was putting out into their community and polluting their community in Louisiana. And they sort of mailed those pellets to, I think, somebody from that company to their home as a form of protest, right? Like a sort of creative stunt. And they were threatened with terrorism charges, right? Because that was a threat. So that's just kind of one example. I mean, we represent the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. It's a Palestinian advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. And they do all sorts of things. They advocate for Palestinian rights. They do Hill visits. They lead campaigns, including boycott campaigns. And they're being sued under the civil provisions of the Material Support to Terrorism statute for material support to Hamas by Israeli plaintiffs, right? And again, like private actors are also taking advantage of the sprawling infrastructure that already exists. And to your point about the ways that some of these same forces have been using existing terrorism laws already against Black communities. In my research on the U.S. campaign case, I encountered a case where some group sued, let me try to remember this, Black Lives Matter activists somewhere, I can't remember where, alleging material support to terrorism. But because there's no domestic terrorism law, they have to kind of have a hook to foreign terrorism. So they were using this logic of, they were using a logic that Palestinians and Black people were engaging in these kinds of ideological exchanges and Black Palestinian solidarity, and therefore Black Lives Matter is influenced by Hamas, which is a foreign terrorist organization, and therefore the law applies. So we're seeing these complete acrobatics already without the expansions. And I just want to also flag in terms of the existing frameworks, it's really sticking with me what you said. Like we can't legislate white supremacy, right? We don't have these kinds of solutions. One of the ways in which we've tried to do damage control is move away from the designation of like let's, the colleagues who are saying let's put Black Lives Matter as a domestic terrorist threat. And you mentioned the Black identity extremism, which is actually a word that was used in law enforcement circles. But we actually have something now that's being used. It's called racially motivated violent extremism, which was the term that the FBI and law enforcement community used to make it race neutral. And so they say, oh, look, we can't say white supremacists. We can't say we're investigating white people. But we can say racially motivated violent extremism because that's sort of a stand-in for ideology. But then who gives meaning to that category? Who's going to initiate the investigations, right? It's all the same agents that have been investigating BIE, who've been pushing for the BLM, designator. So like we have these presumably neutral categories for investigation that are probably already being used to initiate investigations, initiate surveillance of political activism in all of these ways. So those are just some examples. And I also just really appreciate the point that we don't really have anything ready to go so that we can, what Aya was describing made me think of the Shock Doctrine. That's exactly what this is. There's all of these things that our opposition has in place, has been thinking through, has like full infrastructure, and then they just wait for these moments where everybody is stunned, and we get our own people like Sikh Coalition, you know, like these are people that we can be engaging with and should be engaging with to sort of understand this kind of broader context, because the right is ready to go and we're not.
That's such a good segue to a question I have for you, Aya. And I can't resist making an absurd film reference. I don't know if you all saw the Chris Rock's movie, The Head of State. I'm convinced it's like very meaningful, a meaningful piece of art and cultural contribution. But there's a scene in the movie, it came out before even Obama was president. And the concept is that Chris Rock was running to become the first Black president. And there's a scene where a campaign ad goes out by his opponent, and it literally goes something like this: Chris Rock was not at the rally against cancer. Is Chris Rock pro-cancer? And, you know, I feel like you look at groups like the Sikh Coalition, you know, kind of like, oh, yes, we support the terrorism statute. Yes, yes, yes. You know, I'm imagining there's this moment where it's like people feel that, you know, their choice is to sort of join the bandwagon or be pro-terrorism, you know, and that might even apply to progressive legislators like Cori Bush. So kind of wondering, you know, if, you know, we're seeing this moment where people, you know, are privately, even publicly questioning the wisdom of kind of expanding the terrorism framework, but nonetheless are sort of going along with the movement to kind of, you know, pass these laws. Is it realistic to think that, you know, Black and brown communities, social justice movements, the ones that we're supporting, can really resist this momentum to expand the counterterrorism framework without, you know, feeling as though they're kind of sinking under the weight of, you know, the allegation that their lack of support means something, you know, means something frankly dangerous, you know, whether it's to their electoral prospects in the case of legislators, or, you know, to their ability to not then be again the same targets of kind of surveillance and suspicion, you know, as so-called terrorists or, you know, people that support it.
To answer the question succinctly, absolutely, there's a way to combat this, and I'll go into details because I do think there were some really instructive moments in terms of how this particular moment around the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act went down that can be helpful. But your reference to the movie made me think how in the middle of us sort of fighting and trying to reduce harm in this bill, leadership leaked an article that was essentially Cori Bush tanking the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, quoting several members of the Congressional Black Caucus saying that this is an office that in fact wants to see white supremacist threat continue to evolve. So in real time, this is happening, and they are weaponizing this narrative each and every time to intimidate, to scare, and to put in line members that are trying to do some form of agitation and trying to lead some form of agitation. So I think if you sort of boil it down to its essence, when moments like these happen, when in the aftermath of a really tragic incident like Buffalo, within a matter of 24 hours, a piece of legislation that frankly otherwise was going unignored, all of a sudden it was decided that within that week, that bill would pass through the House of Representatives. You have 5 days to do anything. And like moments in the past, I mean, we know that this is what happened with the Patriot Act. There was absolutely no debate, no discussion, no room for amending the legislation. And that is what they tell us as offices, and that is what they tell groups. And oftentimes people take leadership's word for what it is and don't even engage in the discussion. In this incident, we decided, let's see how far we can go. Let's organize to at the very least, reduce harm. And so there were a few things that we did. I think fundamentally, the calculus here is all about votes. In order to get a bill passed, you need the votes to get it passed. So if you can identify several offices that will say, no, we will not vote for this, within your own caucus, that means that Nancy Pelosi will have to go to the Republicans and get Republican support, which in a moment like this was going to prove virtually impossible. So we identified some 6 like-minded offices that had some of the same resignations and issues with the framing. Representative Rashida Tlaib had been very vocal about saying that this kind of framing is dangerous given her own personal experience as a Palestinian American. Representative Ilhan Omar, and several others. And I cannot tell you the number of offices that shocked me that reached out saying, we really don't like this. Is there anything that we can do? And so we made a list of all the offices that had an issue with the legislation, and sent that over to leadership, and that scared them. So that was the beginning, and that was where the article was leaked to stop this. But then we also needed to go out to try to do some of the organizing of organizations that were lobbying for this, right? If you're, if the aftermath of Buffalo was a call of action from the Black community, which is really what this was. The Congressional Black Caucus said that this is what they wanted. Then you needed to organize to demonstrate that, in fact, this was not a monolith ask, or that there was no uniformity around this ask, that the Black community was not speaking as a monolith through the Congressional Black Caucus. And so we tried to do some of that organizing. And frankly, that's where things started to fall apart. So take, for example, the CARE at some point said that they have an issue with the legislation. And after, had sort of gone back and forth about certain edits, they made it clear that if they had gotten 1 or 2 amendments to the bill, that they would be okay with the legislation. Once you say that, you sort of lose your hand in negotiating for an even more robust change to the legislation. Organizations like the ACLU had said, we know this is problematic, but we're actually just gonna not say anything about this piece of legislation. Leadership Conference not only didn't say anything, but sent out emails and made calls to members saying that this is a big priority for all civil rights organizations in the country. The NAACP said that this is their #1 ask. And so we tried to organize, to leverage what we knew were clear pitfalls of the legislation, but it really came down to whether or not, Congresswoman Bush and others were willing to go out ahead of so many other organizations to say and make a point about this piece of legislation with very little support. These largely women of color are so vulnerable, right, to this kind of narrative manipulation that's lodged against them. And when you have no one coming out to say that we stand with you, that we understand that this is an actual dangerous piece of legislation, then they end up just bearing that cost on their own. So I think there's so much institutional building that needs to happen to provide the political window to ensure that members like, Congresswoman Bush, but so many others, such that they feel some level of protection from a machine, frankly, right? A narrative machine, a political machine, a fundraising machine. And so that institution building hasn't really been done yet. I think the other thing is, recognizing that actually, if we throw our weight around as organizations, as a movement, that we can actually get things done. Like Diala said, over the course of a year, this bill went from a bill that would quite literally be disastrous to a bill that by and large ended up kind of losing a lot of its teeth. Yes, it creates offices within these agencies, but I think no one's under any delusion, like all of these agencies aren't already going after domestic terrorism. Presumably the entire DHS office is like working and thinking through what the nexus of foreign terrorism is within domestic terrorism. We know that the FBI has already been doing this. FOIA request after FOIA request demonstrates that they already have categorized people as domestic terrorists. So in some ways it codifies what already exists. But we wouldn't have been able to get here had it not been for organizing for a year. And I think we would have been able to go further had we had and been willing to have organizations that were ready to really throw down and say that there is absolutely no way we would support this. And I guarantee you this bill would not have been passed, because so many members, not even the ones that, like, you and I are also familiar with as being progressive champions, had very mixed feelings about this piece of legislation. There's a lot of buyer's remorse post 9/11. There's understanding that we did some really horrible things and that we need to think critically about how to move forward. And I really think it's just a question of organizing.
Thank you. To leave time for audience questions, I want to end with a final question for all the panelists. I'm going to warn you, it's a doozy. It goes back to this issue of contradiction. And what I want to surface, I think, is a contradiction that's emerged both in this conversation and perhaps in discussions about abolition more generally, which is that on one hand, including because you are each in your own way incredible advocates, you've managed to completely persuade me, at least, that trying to respond to white supremacy through counterterrorism legislation, if nothing else, is really a mistake. At the same time, not passing legislation like the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, I have to assume, is not going to make life easier for Black Muslims. It's not going to stop the surveillance and targeting of Black Lives Matter activists, and in the same manner, I think we can continue to reflect and refine and center demands for abolition. But at some level, I think we have to understand these are conversations happening on the left. These are conversations happening in Black and brown communities. When we go, when we get arrested, no white prosecutor is going to be applying the abolitionist framework to us, including because we're literally recalling progressive prosecutors left and right, because the George Floyd moment is over, in case you didn't get the memo. And so what does it mean to sort of be advocating for the better path when at the same time we're working in systems that we know are not going to extend us grace, right? And what does it mean to, at some level, be calling for, to kind of stop this infrastructure from coming online in the case of, white violence towards our communities, when we know that we're probably one, Black Lives Matter protest turn up away from seeing these legislation pass in any event and again be applied to our communities. So in essence, what does it mean to be thinking of policy in ways that require a type of generosity and expansiveness that we know our communities will never receive from these carceral systems? And then, what do you tell Black and brown activists, people who are grieving, people who are burying their loved ones in the wakes of these preventable tragedies, these tragedies enabled by the toxic white supremacist, culture that, America's kind of grass-fed on? What do you tell them if they're looking to channel their rage into action, if they're looking for answers, if they're looking for ways to respond to the grief and rage that they're feeling? How do we move forward, as a community, as a movement, without falling into these traps that are being set for us? And like I said, it's a doozy, but I invite anyone who has, thoughts forming to kind of share.
I was going to see how long I could wait before someone would jump in. And my two co-panelists are much smarter than I am. So, I mean, I in full disclosure, this is a question that animated this panel and that we have wrestled with internally before coming into this space. And I don't necessarily feel any further along now than when we talked about the need to at least surface this in a public setting for our own, I mean, as people, for our own human need to sort of wrestle with this, but also I think with the safe assumption that this is a source of pain and conflict and challenge that you all are wrestling with and that our movement folks are wrestling with around the country. I want to start by acknowledging in a sincere way my view that as attorneys on some level, the way forward, particularly around this, is not really one for us to chart, as Diala explained, I think, so well, and I know Aya is living with this in her work. There's absolutely no way to litigate our communities to the kind of safety that we need following Buffalo and so many other crises. That is, I think, painfully obvious. The hard and inescapable part of your question is that I think you're also talking to us as people and not in our role. And on that front, I'm torn. I do think you used a couple of words that sort of stick with me, and one was generosity and grace, and so I guess I'll start there. I don't think that having the courage, and I say that with caution, because as you set up, people are suffering and trying to figure out a way to put the remnants of their lives together after having faced this violence. But I don't think that refusing to adopt a system and a framework and approach that has done so much tremendous violence on its own for a tactical purpose, and I think sort of investing in the domestic terrorism legislative frame in order to attack and respond to these extreme expressions of white supremacist violence leads to sort of long-term safety. I think it is a tactic, and in some sense maybe even a valuable tactic, but I don't think it's a strategy that actually transforms and improves our safety long-term. And so I don't think of that as a question of generosity. I think of it as a question of fortitude, and maybe one place where at times I've come back and tried to derive some sense of inspiration is out of the real crisis of post 9/11, out of the fallout of the human rights crisis following 9/11, and at the intersection of Black political uprising in response to the just crisis level killing of Black folks by police and the white supremacist violence we're seeing in Buffalo, is an opportunity to unwind some of the really unhelpful silos that the last 20 years has put us in, where Muslim communities are isolated and targeted in ways that force them only to think internally, to try to make it to the next thing, where Black communities, and I recognize, I mean, I work and frankly live at the intersection of a lot of these identities, but where Black folks are trying to call on movement partners to recognize that the pain and suffering and crisis that they're facing. I think maybe where there's something for us to work on is to recognize that, maybe we're being forced now to recognize that there really is there's no space between our struggles. There's really no distinction between it. And so we, as painful as it is and as uncomfortable as it is, we have no alternative other than to think strategically in the long term. And that as much as there's a really righteous reflex to try to take advantage of every tactic available to try to get a little bit of space and safety, that our mission has to be a much more long-term one. And I don't even know how much I believe in that saying it.
A few things come to mind. The first is, I think fundamentally what this is about is the belief, I think, that everyone has, that we all deserve to live lives free of fear, free of violence, free of intimidation. We all want to live in safety. We want safety for ourselves, bodily safety. We want to live in safe communities. And so then the question becomes, are we safer when we trust law enforcement officials, wherein we know there's a huge white supremacist infiltration issue, to sort of have unfettered power to come into our communities and disrupt our protests? Are we safer when we trust the FBI to protect us against white supremacists? Are we safer when we trust a DOJ headed by the Trump administration to really ensure that police officers are actually held accountable when they use their force against us with complete impunity? I mean, are we really safer when we use these tools? And I think when you think about that, the answer just becomes unequivocally no. It's hard, because then what that means is we really do have one another. We cannot simply rely, we cannot rely on the state. We cannot. This is a state that is rooted in and based on and built on white supremacist principles. Relying on it to protect us is not only frightening, but just outright dangerous to our very safety. And I think then the question becomes like, how do we retain some level of safety while living in a country like this and living in a world like this one? And I think there's, a lot of ways that we've been thinking in our office about safety. How do we legislate, maybe not against white supremacy, but for safety? What are the investments that we need in our communities such that we feel some level of bodily autonomy and access to resources so that we can have self-determination, have the ability to determine the fate of our lives in our communities? How do we ensure that at the very least we can participate in our political landscape? How are folks being able to access the funds they need to keep themselves alive, to make sure that folks who are unhoused have housing such that they are not so in need, that they live in such scarcity, that we and them can all be manipulated by corporate narratives that are being just throttled in our TVs and in our media. So I think sadly it's just a really hard question, and the answer is just as difficult to piece together, in part because it requires us to rethink what we need to be safe. And that requires all of us to work together across, as Omar mentioned, to build that coalition, across issues, build it with climate activists, build it with, immigration organizations, and, frontline organizations, to really think through what our demands are to secure our safety in this moment. And I'll add this to it. I think that does not preclude us from holding folks accountable. I think I'll give you an example. I mean, at the height of, or recently, I was talking to several mothers whose sons were killed by police officers, and their ask was, the Department of Justice needs to hold these police officers accountable. Do I trust the Department of Justice? Never. But do I think that there's something to be said about holding folks accountable in this moment in time? Absolutely. And so, the question then of safety does not preclude us from thinking strategically about how to hold certain powers accountable. But it does require us to think, I think, expansively about the quote unquote legislative vehicles that we can move forward to attain some level of autonomy and self-determination.
Tiala, is there anything you want to add to close us out before we take, if we have generosity and grace from our sign language interpreters, perhaps one or two audience questions?
Yeah, sorry. Not honestly much to add to what Omar and Aya shared so eloquently. Maybe two quick things. One is as a reminder in terms of as a frame of like what a radical response can look like, and this is directly related to what I was just sharing of thinking about what the root causes of white supremacist violence are, and if that, in addition to safety, is another way we need to be thinking about action, whether it's at the policy level or in other ways or at organizing levels, right? So, some ways in which I've seen this articulated are, let's look at the legislative, the takeover of white supremacists in legislatures, right? And I saw some efforts to insert that into the legislation too, right? Like, let's like document, and it wasn't the legislatures, but the takeover of the presence of white supremacist groups, organized groups in the military and in law enforcement. Like, can we document that, investigate that? These are places where we can sort of begin looking at root causes. They're obviously, I think to the point of accountability, and to similarly the generosity word that you used, Chinyere. I mean, I don't think any of us are trying to be generous to the Buffalo shooter, right? It's a question of, are we asking the right questions of how to respond to these moments, and do we want to put all of our energy into just calling for, more state power when we know, I mean, it's going to get prosecuted, but we're going to continue to have this kind of violence. And then the other frame, which I just want to kind of bring into the room, is to think from an internationalist perspective also. Because, we talked about how the foreign terrorist organization and the domestic terrorism thing has this binary, and we've broken down the binary, but let's also not forget the white supremacy is a global movement in real, very practical, concrete terms, right? These networks and these organizations in the US are building ties with, groups in Europe and elsewhere. And so let's break down that binary, but also understand it in this internationalist lens, build these connections across, globally, other groups that are reckoning with colonialism and white supremacy, and also learning from them, but also like kind of building power in those ways, and not just having this like really narrow US lens to what is really a global problem. And then just the last thing I will say really quickly is to the organizers, and acknowledging that there are no organizers on this panel. But I think Aya said, like, brought in some of those voices in terms of like, what are people's demands, and people's demands are safety. I guarantee you that if you go to a mosque or a place where they're, really kind of viewed as targets of this kind of violence, they're not going to say, we actually want a police car. The question is oftentimes posed, a police car posed in front of our mosque. The question often posed to them is, shall we give you a police car outside your mosque, right? So how can we change the question that we're asking of people, and what are we offering them that are like different in terms of solutions that are different? A resource for folks to think about that I found really useful from an organizing and thinking about some of these policy interventions is Political Research Associates, PRA, has excellent analysis on not just how these groups operate, how they're organizing themselves, where they're really emerging and what some of their next moves might look like, but also like pretty nuts and bolts toolkits for especially movement groups and organizers in terms of like how you might want to think about preparing, protecting yourself, that kind of thing. Again, that's more micro level. It doesn't answer the bigger questions, but there are some starting points there. Thank you.
Do we have time for one question? Okay. Is there anyone in the audience who has a question for our esteemed panel? Okay. I'm going to deliver a microphone to you. 1 second.
Hi. Thank you so much. I'll just go right in. My question really builds off what you were just talking about. I was thinking about the folks who are creating and who want to center creating in their work, especially, creating things that can be lined up, whether they're wish lists whether that's, writing draft amendments, from the scale of imagination, being on large frameworks to spending, their hours under capitalism drafting things that would only be feasible in a moment of unprecedented political will or capacity. I guess the question, I would love to hear, your advice about choosing, how and where we spend our time. There's limited capacity and there's limited, there feels like, as a rising law student, rising 3L in law school, it feels like, you can do everything potentially, but not at the same time. So you do have to kind of choose that path. So for the people who are already, juggling so much, trying to find space to create, and may want to move that to the center of their work, especially, really thinking about getting out like written products and deliverables that could be ready for unprecedented moments of solidarity and collaboration. I would love to just ask any advice, any thoughts about, even how I'm getting to that point, but especially focusing on like where it does feel like, there is a limited capacity, not only in hours of the day, but also in, the way that you choose how to spend those hours under capitalism. So that's the prompt.
I think for me, the first thing that comes to mind is that you're not doing this work alone. So, that the, to give you an example, I'm one of those people in my office who, like, if I have to write a memo, I'm going to wait until the memo is perfect before anyone gets to see it. And then I end up never sending it out because it needs to be perfect. And I realized at some point that like no work is ever going to get done so long as we're placing all of this weight and burden of perfectionism on our backs. So I've been trying over the last year of just like, if there's a thing I'm noticing that feels particularly important, and that I feel like I have a skill or I have a thought that should be introduced into that conversation, it may not be perfect, but I'm going to put something together and I'm going to put it out there. And even if I'm not the person who puts it together, I know who I'm going to call to sort of brainstorm and think through this idea with me, such that maybe between the two of us, we can get something out there and put it out there. At the end of the day, it may not be the thing, right, that saves the moment, or that shifts the dynamic and the pressure that any and all of us feel. But just taking some of that weight off of you, I think feels incredibly important. And just reminding yourself and anyone really that, like, at the end of the day, what's asked of us is to show up, to do the best work that we can at any given point in time, and leave the rest to the community and our collective to really shift things dynamically.
Hi, everyone. So I obviously agree with all of your strategic conclusions about how we should be thinking about counterterrorism responses and legislation. But Dial, your point about history, and your point about struggling with language caused me to think a little bit about this thought experiment. So if the sort of iconic image of the modern terrorist is a Muslim Arab man driven by an ideology of US hegemony around, sort of Middle East and oil and Israel and all of that. Think about maybe the origin story of counterterrorism, which I think we can place at Reconstruction or the abolition amendments, thinking specifically about the KKK Act, which had criminal enforcement provisions, and there the iconic image of a terrorist was a Klansman, and the ideology at that time, or a limited amount of time, was this radical vision of racial equality and attempting to stamp out white supremacy. So we have the the Department of Justice, which now is malicious, was actually created in 1870 to enforce the Reconstruction Amendments. And, you know, in South Carolina, the then created U.S. Attorney's Office, something like 400 indictments of white supremacists, et cetera, before the Supreme Court neutered it. So I guess, you know, and Brian Stevenson talks about in the lynching museum, this image of racial terror. So I guess my question, I know Aya shares some of my curiosity about the liberatory potential of the abolitionist amendments. But my question is, if we can't reclaim that vision, is there anything usable from that past in thinking about white supremacist violence?
It's a really good question, and I'll just start by, I think, questioning a premise, which sorry. Well, I think that it requires you to assume that these institutions are salvageable, right? It requires you to assume that we can repurpose, redefine terrorism. If the container is going to be given meaning by literally the same people that have been trained to identify the Muslim terrorists, but also the communist terrorists, right? I mean, there's also the 70s era terrorist, the plane hijacker terror, like all these other images of like who the quintessential terrorist has been. That I don't know that I believe that we can move, you know, the FBI, DHS to like, we can narrate that back to the future, right? So like, I think that's one place, but your deeper point is like a question of whether we're like policing language and whether we're saying, we're telling people who, as Aya started out by saying, are like feeling terror, are feeling terrorized, are, you know, wanting to name it. Like, you know, I think Black folks are like, we know white terrorism when we see it, like, don't tell us what not to call it. Like, that's also a very real and valid response to, I think, what we're bringing as a very like policy critique to these approaches. And I think it's really worth engaging with. And like where I land is like, I understand it. And just my concern is that narrative begets policy solutions and gets hijacked. So that's not a full answer, but it's two things that I thought about.
The thing that comes to mind to me in terms of lesson learned or what is applicable from that era today is the reality is that conversation around the Reconstruction Amendments, I mean, the birth of the Reconstruction Amendments only came about because of an actual violent war. And in some ways, there was a victor of that war. And that victor then created institutions to try to remedy, you know, what the vestiges of the institution of slavery would be, not recognizing that there then would create a backlash that became so severe, so entrenched within every single system that we now in 2022 are fighting with that aftermath of entrenchment each and every day. And so I think of this period often also in terms of war in some ways, not to say that we are, but just to say that like there really is a war of ideas and a war of ideology that will help to set, you know, the fate, frankly, of this country for a very long time. And maybe it's because my thought on this is informed by the fact that I see the opposite side each and every day, right? I see the language that they use. I see them saying, you know, Antifa is the threat. I mean, where the hell is Antifa, right? I mean, it's like 10 guys that they've now decided is an army that we need to rise up against. And the reality of the matter is that what we're up against, not to be, you know, dramatic here, but like we're talking about a right-wing neo-fascist agenda that is actually arming itself. And so in some ways, I think back to that era often, but I think back to that era in some ways, both to when I feel like I need to push myself to imagine something greater, because I do think the way in which, folks who were involved in the Reconstruction amendments in drafting them were so imaginative. But I also think about the entrenchment, and I also think about the backlash, and I also think about, how conservative Southern culture, Confederate culture actually came in the aftermath of the war and not during the war. And so I think often about how that entrenchment is happening in this moment, because I see it happening each and every day. And because of that, then I don't think, me personally, I think I have the capacity to see the lessons learned as exciting as much as I see them as dangers or pitfalls that need to be avoided as we're thinking through what a future looks like. But that's just to say that I think how we move forward requires, yes, that we learn from our pitfalls, but frankly requires completely new tactics, strategies, thinking to really meet the moment and where we want to head in the future.
I think that's a great way to end our discussion today. And I'm so grateful for the expertise of my co-panelists, as well as the thoughtful engagement of all of you who've been listening in. I hope this discussion was informative. As Diala and Tenjiwe earlier in the conference put it, at times, the best place we can be as a movement is just trying to ask better questions. And I hope that you found this to be a helpful exploration today. So thanks so much, all
And
of you.
thanks, Chiniere, for asking great questions. Truly.
Yes,
No,
indeed.
truly. Thank you.